20 years ago, Chris McCandless turns his back on modern society to live a life in tune with nature, leaving behind friends, family, and a promising future. He heads out on the open road, a road that is calling him to the ultimate wilderness, Alaska.
Alaska, she bites awful hard.
People don't realize how rugged it really is up here until they get into it.
The story of Chris McCandless and his journey into the wild has been told in books and films and captured the imagination of the world.
He liked to push the envelope in the end result. That's where it all went bad.
You make a mistake in Alaska, it most likely is going to cost you your life.
But now, 20 years later, and for the first time, we walk that journey through his eyes, using his diary, rare photographs, and interviews with the people he met along the way.
He was that close to having almost a perfect adventure.
Join us as we go back to the wild. Alaska is a harsh, rugged frontier, a dangerous country with no place for weakness.
Alaska, she's got a mind of her own, and it's a wild place to try to tackle. So if you're in the mindset to do that, then, you know, good on you, but you better be prepared, you know, because she bites awful hard.
For someone looking for adventure, Alaska represents one of the ultimate challenges.
Especially men, they want to know what it's like to go up against nature. Kind of a test of manhood. But I think the issue comes is when they take on adventures that are way bigger than them.
It's an unforgiving country. The vastness of the area, it's incredible. You can go out 2 miles from town and you're out in the wilderness. You make a mistake out there, it most likely is going to cost you your life.
In central Alaska, Roger Ellis is the only state trooper in 15,000 square miles. When there's trouble, he gets the call.
On September 6th of '92, some hunters had found a body in a bus. And when they said that, I pretty much knew where they were, out on Stampede Trail near Healy. We landed, and I got out and went up to the bus, and I could tell that this was a human being without even going in the bus. It's a distinctive odor. I took photographs, and then I started searching for anything I could find to help me find out whether or not I've got a homicide, suicide, accidental death. I wanted to make sure I didn't have a criminal scene.
He finds a note on the door. Inside, Ellis finds a body. The bus is filled with camping equipment, rolls of film, and books.
I found a diary. You could tell that this individual got sick and had probably most likely died of natural causes. Based on all those, I determined we do not have a criminal investigation here.
With no idea who the man is or how he got here, Ellis writes up a press release and includes excerpts from the diary. The story spreads across the country and the world. 3,000 miles away in Carthage, South Dakota, Wayne Westerberg runs a wheat harvesting crew.
We were on our way back, pulling equipment, and Bobby called me on the two-way and told me to turn to such and such FM station that there was a story on about someone that died in Alaska. And he said, it sounds a lot like Alex. I had a a really bad gut feeling right then that this might have been him.
By the time Wayne first meets Chris McCandless, Chris has abandoned his own name and is traveling as Alex Supertramp. Wayne gives the traveler a lift and ultimately a job.
He seemed like he had a good attitude. He wanted to work. He jumped right in. He was fast to learn. He liked running machinery. He always wanted to do something. Given the chance, I was like a kid in a candy store. The longer that I was around him, I really did learn to trust him. He was making a trek around the United States. I mean, I knew that he was wanting to go to Alaska, that it was just part of his adventure. And the timetable that he had given to me was that he was going to be back to help us in the fall. That I really thought he would be. I mean, I didn't doubt that he would be back to help, because that was kind of our last verbal agreement, you know. So I didn't really think a lot about it.
But fall comes, and there is no sign of Alex. The radio story makes Wayne nervous. In Alaska, the medical examiner determines the body weighs only 67 pounds, and there are no signs of foul play. The cause of death? Starvation. But the troopers find a wallet. The ID belongs to a man named Chris McCandless.
Just because you got a wallet that says John Henry, the condition of the body, you could not tell it was John Henry. There was no comparison of the photograph on the wallet with the individual that I'd found in the bus. So you have to wait.
In South Dakota, Wayne can't wait any longer.
I tried to call up there to the sheriff's department and talk to someone.
Can you hook me up with a sergeant that was in charge of that case?
He has one of Alex's tax forms and makes a startling discovery. Alex's real name is Chris McCandless. The troopers track down Chris's parents, Walt and Billy McCandless. It's been 2 years since they've seen or heard from their son.
They told me, and I think I kind of went into shock after Walt came home and was told. He took me into the bedroom and kind of had me lay down. And I stayed in bed for 5 days and didn't eat and didn't speak.
When Chris died, I was angry. That's the emotion that I had. And that surprised me. I can't even tell you why I was angry exactly, but I was. I wasn't angry at him or the world or anything. I was just angry.
The body in the bus is now identified, yet many mysteries remain.
The biggest question we had was why? Next comes how and where, but the biggest question, I think, for a parent is why?
In an abandoned city bus in the wilds of Alaska, a body is found. Police identify the man as Chris McCandless, but they have no idea how he got here. The only clues left behind are Chris's pictures and his diary. In Chris's diary, he wrote a cryptic entry for each of his 113 days in Alaska. Day 1 reads,
Exit Fairbanks. Sitting Galleon.
Jim Galleon is an electrician.
I was headed to Anchorage from Fairbanks. I saw a hitchhiker, so I picked him up. If I was walking during the winter, you know, I'd sure like somebody to pick me up. Hey, where you headed?
Stampede Trail.
All right.
Jim knows this man is different.
When I was fishing for a name, all he would tell me was Supertramp. I said, Supertramp? And Then he told me his first name was Chris. And I said, well, Chris Supertramp? I fished for a little while, but he refuses to give his last name.
Chris says he's looking to go into the bush and live off the land.
He wanted to know if I knew where the Stampede Trail was. He didn't really know anything about the country, but he had read in a book something about the Stampede Trail, and that's where he wanted to go in and camp. He seemed well educated, but he was naive about what he was getting into. I saw a cheap backpack, a cheap tent. He was going in with a .22 rifle and 200 rounds of ammo, which is not enough for up here. He didn't have any rubber boots, rain gear. He just was not prepared. I tried to get him to let somebody know where he was going to be and for how long, but he didn't want anything to do with that either. When we got to the end of the road, he was excited. He put his watch, I think 85 cents and change, and an old road map, threw that on my dash. And I said, you know, I don't need that. He said, well, I don't need it either. I don't want to know what time it is. I don't want to know what day it is. I don't want to know where I'm at. He was just raring to go. Hey, hold on a minute, man. So I had a pair of extra toughs in my truck. Why don't you take these boots with you? So I gave him those boots, tried to keep his feet dry, and I gave him my lunch, and he put the boots on, had me take one picture of him by the back of my truck, and then Chris just took off. All right, good luck. Thank you. He couldn't wait to go. My last thoughts were, he's not really ready, he doesn't know what he's doing. But I was pretty confident that once he got in there for a couple days, he'll get cold, he'll get wet, he'll get hungry, he'd hike back out to the blacktop. I may have been the last guy to see him.
But even in death, Chris's journey continues. The troopers developed the film found on the bus. The pictures tell a story of an amazing journey. A journey that began in California in 1968.
From the first day, you began to see his personality emerge. He didn't need 80,000 people to say, that's a good place to go. He didn't need one. We could see that he was marching to a different drummer, and that wasn't going to change at all.
He was very athletic, and he was very smart and capable. And there weren't many things that Chris decided he was going to try and do that he wasn't successful at.
But after graduating from college with honors, Chris decides to give away what remains of his $24,000 college fund and disappears.
He did feel that modern life had become too structured, too goal-oriented, too path-specific, and he was against all of those things. You don't need to know where you're going to be tomorrow. And his journey reflects that. Every day was a new day.
He just wanted freedom. He didn't want to have to answer to anybody. He wanted to be totally free. When he woke up in the morning, he wanted to just see how he felt, take a look around, choose his direction, and start down the path without thinking about anything else except that looks interesting.
For the next 2 years after graduating from college, Chris lives off the grid. His parents do everything they can to find him. even hiring private detectives. But Chris leaves no trail. He writes,
Don't settle down in one place. Move around. Be nomadic. Make each day a new horizon. The very basic core of a man's living spirit is his passion for adventure.
but his adventures often get him into trouble. In Arizona, a flash flood in a canyon destroys his car. He simply walks away from it. Even more determined to make it solely on his own, he burns his money. Finally free of his money and possessions, he presses on. In Alaska, after several days on the Stampede Trail, Chris walks 10 miles into the bush and runs into the Teklanika River. In the winter, the river is covered with ice. It seems safe to cross. Until the river is freezing, and Chris struggles to get out.
He had survived risk-taking that other people never experienced in the first place. Every time you push the envelope and survive, you become bolder and less cognizant of what the downsides are, I think. And I think clearly his journey reflects that.
During all his travels before Alaska, Chris travels alone, but makes friends everywhere.
I met Alex Supertramp 20 years ago. He was a lazy hitchhiker sitting on the side of the road eating berries out of a milk jug, cut down milk jug, with a book in his hand. He was just kicking back with his thumb kind of up. And we went by and I said, man, we gotta pick that kid up because he's never gonna get a ride. He's the laziest hitchhiker I ever saw.
Chris hits the road with Jan and her boyfriend Bobcat.
Hey boy, you hitchhiking?
Yeah. You ever meet somebody you just like from the start? That was Alex Supertramp. When the first time he told me he was Alex Supertramp, I laughed. You know, he hadn't done much tramping. If you talked to him for 10 minutes about Alaska, you knew it was his heart's desire.
How you doing?
I'm Alex. He had a hunger to learn all the things about a non-traditional lifestyle, like from cooking outside to climbing mountains. And I said, man, somebody needs to school you. And then Bobcat began to tell him things. It's about surviving from shelter to shelter, taking showers, riding freight trains. And he hit the deck of running. He liked it. You know, he liked that. It appealed to him. I said, do your parents know where you are? And he said, no, I haven't written to him, I haven't looked at him. And he told us the story about being in the desert and burning his money, burying his plates. And I just thought, man, I said, are you out of your mind?
Jan and Bobcat take Chris to a place called the Slabs. It's a community of squatters who live on the abandoned concrete foundation slabs at an old army base near Niland, California.
He always had the dream for his quest to Alaska. It was prominent in everything. Everything was a plan for Alaska. I got the impression that every place he went, every experience he had, he was storing up to learn about his quest to Alaska.
Throughout his travels, Chris stays in touch with Jan, sending her his last postcard from Fairbanks.
This is the last communication you shall receive from me. I now walk out to live amongst the wild. It was great knowing you.
I was concerned. It's been great knowing you. I go to live amongst the wild. And I told Bobcat, what's he gonna do, go up there and die? He said, no, he's going up there to live forever.
Chris McCandless walks out of the modern world and onto the open road. his quest for adventure and need to live on his own terms, close to nature, drives him to leave behind everything familiar to take on the ultimate challenge, Alaska. Several days after being dropped off, Chris makes an amazing find about 20 miles out from the head of the Stampede Trail. In his journal, he simply writes, "Magic Bus Day." The bus is old and run down. But in the middle of nowhere, it's a godsend. Inspired, Chris carves a manifesto.
2 years he walks the earth, ultimate freedom, an extremist whose home is the road. No longer to be poisoned by civilization, he flees and walks alone upon the land to become lost in the wild. Alex Supertramp, May 1992.
Chris uses the bus as a base camp. He settles down and prepares to live off the land.
Living off the land appeals to people in a way that's really beyond logical. It's so exciting, and you feel so comfortable and self-reliant, knowing that no matter what happens, you can provide for yourself.
But Alaska is unlike any other place, and the learning curve is steep. From Chris's journal, his first week at the bus.
Weakness, snowed in. Disaster, 4-day famine.
Chris McCandless chose to go to a part of North America that has an extremely low density of plant foods and not a particularly high density of animal foods either, but he chose one of the most difficult places a person could possibly choose.
Chris survived many brushes with death, which makes him confident he can handle anything. But he's never faced this part of the Alaskan wilderness before. In May, it warms up, bringing more game. From his journal.
Ptarmigans, squirrels, porcupine, graybird.
But it isn't enough. Chris spends more calories hunting his food than he gets from eating what he caught.
For someone like me that has a lot of experience hunting and gathering for food, I would only need to spend probably 4 hours a day to feed myself. For somebody that doesn't have those skills, it literally could take all day and still not have enough food to eat at the end of the day.
Chris isn't worried. He's used to pushing his body to extremes during his travels. And he is always looking for a new adventure, the next challenge. Only a few months after his college graduation, Chris decides to ride the length of the Colorado River. It's an extremely difficult and dangerous trip. Hundreds have died trying to make the trek. But McCandless is not deterred. For the next month, Chris sees no one. Living off a 10-pound bag of rice and the fish he catches, he thrives on the challenge. From his journal.
Can this be the same Alex that set out in July 1990? Malnutrition and the road have taken their toll on his body. Over 25 pounds lost, but his spirit is soaring.
But Alaska is a much harder place to survive than any Chris has experienced before.
In a short-term survival situation, the things that are important are your clothing, shelter, fire, and if it's a slightly longer survival situation, having good, clean water. But in a long-term survival situation, a situation of actually living off the land, food becomes your primary focus.
The squirrels Chris is eating and supplementing with plants isn't going to be enough. Then, Chris gets lucky. Next to buffalo, moose are the biggest land animals in America. A moose provides between 400 to 1,000 pounds of meat, something Chris desperately needs to survive. Chris has a .22, a rifle most consider too small for hunting something like a moose. But on this day, for Chris, it is enough. Chris is ecstatic. This is a big victory. But killing the moose is easy. What comes next proves much more difficult.
What Chris needed was to find a way to store that moose.
You just have to really be careful about how you treat your meat up here. And all the hunters that live up here will tell you that's a huge thing from the minute that you shoot the animal is taking care of the meat.
On his travels, Chris always asks for advice. In South Dakota, some hunters tell him the best way to preserve meat is to build a smoker by digging out a hole in a hill. It takes Chris 6 days to cut up the moose and move it to his makeshift smoker. It proves to be a costly mistake.
Any survival book would talk about drying meat as a primary means to storing it. You cut it in thin strips, you can sun dry it, or you can dry it over a fire.
But Chris didn't do that. As bad as things seem, it's about to get worse. In 1992, Chris McCandless turns his back on the modern world and walks out on his life and into the wilds of Alaska. But it hasn't been easy. Chris kills a moose. It's enough food to feed him for a year. But he doesn't know how to take care of the meat. From Chris's journal on June 14th.
Maggots already. Smoking appears ineffective. Looks like disaster. I now wish I had never shot the moose. One of the great tragedies of my life.
I think the biggest mistake that Chris made was not understanding how to preserve meat. I think that mistake wasn't just physically debilitating to Chris. I think it was emotionally debilitating, because if he had known what to do, he would have had enough food to keep him going for months.
The moose is ruined. His food problem is becoming critical. There is only enough moose left for one meal. Chris writes in his journal,
Trying to salvage what can of moose, but henceforth will learn to accept my errors, however great they be.
Without the moose, Chris is back to eating small game. Not nearly enough to stave off his hunger.
His journal indicates that he was experiencing malnutrition shortly after getting there and starvation within a month. And that has really struck many people about reading Chris's journal, that it's almost exclusively about the food he was eating. People become so preoccupied with food they can hardly think about or talk about or write about anything else.
Apparently, the next week, Chris goes hungry. In his journal, there is only a line through each day, perhaps indicating he did not eat. When he can't get meat, he eats plants and berries. He has a book, Tenina Plant Lore, he uses as a guide. He eats many plants he finds near the bus. But it is never enough. Chris McCandless has spent 2 months on his own in the wild, living off the land. He is living his dream, but he is feeling alone. He turns to his books. In Family Happiness, Tolstoy writes, "The only certain happiness in life is to live for others." Chris would later write,
"Happiness only real when shared."
After 66 days in Alaska, Chris makes a monumental decision. He decides to trek back out. It's 20 miles from the bus back to civilization. Only one thing stands between Chris and his goal: the Teklenika River. The river is thawed and moving way too fast. Does he take his chances? Or does he pack it in and hike back to the bus? To get home, Chris must cross the river. But he may have underestimated the strength of the current. Chris McCandless is ready to go home. All that stands in his way is the mighty Teklenika River.
All that would have to happen is Chris gets across that river, Chris gets back to civilization, he's in reasonably good health, he replenishes his body, and he's got a wonderful story to tell. You know, he was that close to having almost a perfect adventure.
Chris thought that ultimately he could conquer this river because he always found a way to escape in the past. On the Sea of Cortez, Chris takes his canoe out too far. And suddenly, he can't get back to shore. Incredibly, after battling the waves and the current for what seems like an eternity, he reaches the beach. Once again, Chris faces death and survives. But in Alaska, the river is just too strong. There is no way he can cross.
Once he got to the river and discovered that he could not cross that river where he was, he had a few choices. One would be to try to find another place to cross the river.
A short walk upstream, the river runs into smaller streams that could have been passable. 1/2 mile downstream, a cable runs across the river with a basket to carry hunters over the Tek. But Chris hadn't learned the area.
There was a degree of aversion to being over-prepared. That sort of took away from the true adventure of it. But remember, it's probably really sapped his strength to get there, so he knows one place that he's safe. So he chose to go back to the bus. That was his decision.
Chris writes of this day.
Disaster. River looks impossible. Lonely. Scared.
I think that he probably felt in Alaska that he could get out, and he discovered that he couldn't. And there was a point where he said, it's a little different situation than I've been in before. And then after that, what happened is he became too weak to get out. He literally could not. He was trapped.
The next 30 days are hard. Chris spends all his time looking for food, but most days comes up empty. He's starving, and his body is starting to fail him.
Human beings are instinctively attracted to calorie-dense foods, like a stick of butter where you fit a lot of calories into a small area. And there's not a lot of that in the wild. And so when you're dealing with foods that don't have a high caloric density, you have to eat enormous volumes of food to actually get enough calories to survive.
For Chris's body size, he needs at least 3,000 calories a day.
In order to get that many calories, he would have had to eat 8 or 10 pounds of Hedysarum roots, or 3 gallons of blueberries, or he would have had to eat about 25 red squirrels a day. That's a heck of a lot of red squirrels.
In his journal, Chris writes,
Day 100, made it. But in weakest condition of life, death looms as serious threat. Too weak to walk out, have literally become trapped in the wild.
Chris McCandless survives 100 days alone in Alaska. But he is starving and too weak to leave. Chris writes his last note and takes a picture.
I have had a happy life, and thank the Lord. Goodbye, and may God bless all.
That particular picture is one that I can look at. I just look directly into Chris's eyes. And although it upsets Walt, that picture gives me peace. I know that Chris is at peace.
I still have trouble with that one because I know the consequence. That's the only reason. The other thing about it, it's the only picture he took more than one of. There's meaning in that. He wanted to make sure that he conveyed his final message.
It tells me so much that he's achieved what he went to do, and he has no regrets. And he's on his way. He's on another journey.
On August 18th, 1992, physically exhausted, Christopher McCandless zips himself into the sleeping bag his mother made for him.
I heard him cry out to me, "Mom, Mom, help me, help me." And I went flying up out of bed and woke Walt, and he says, "What's the matter?" I said, Chris just called me." He said, "What?" And he said he's to help him. He's in trouble. And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and I said, "What are we gonna do?" And he said, "Pray." That's all we could do.
That night, Chris dies alone in Fairbanks City Transit Bus 142. His last journal entry is day 113. It's simply a circled number.
He's been in a lot of situations. He liked to push the envelope. You know, now when you look back on it, it does seem that he pushed himself a little too hard on these deals, took a little too many chances, and of course, in the end result, that's where it all went bad.
Chris's life has been celebrated in books and movies. 20 years later, he continues to touch and inspire millions.
It hurts my heart and it hurts my head when I think about the way he died and the grief his parents went through and are going through. But I'm so thankful and grateful that he was my friend. And I believe he'd be my friend today if he was still alive.
It's a heck of a way to write a book. Into the Wild, The Adventures of Chris McCandless. It's a never-ending story now, and his death created a story that will never stop. So I guess he hit a home run for a book. His first one, and only one.
He was an adventurer, you know, and we lost one. And I think that hurts us.
I don't know what we would have done without those journals and those pictures. And then the friends that he had met and made along his way, if they hadn't stepped up to the plate and offered their friendship and the things that they knew about Chris, I don't know if we had ever found out about his journeys and the things that he did accomplish. I mean, he did accomplish quite a bit. He found what he was looking for. He found peace at 24 years old.
After Chris's death, Walt and Billy made the trip out to Bus 142. They left a plaque to commemorate Chris's life. Today, they oversee a foundation in Chris's name that keeps his story alive through books, DVDs, and speaking engagements. Chris was an adventurer. He was a doer, not a talker. He walked out on a life he considered ordinary to forge a new one on the road. A road that took him all around the country and eventually Alaska. While his journey ultimately proved fatal, his spirit continues to inspire others to learn from his missteps, embrace his adventurous spirit, and experience the wonders of nature.